A young girl accompanied her mother to an animal shelter to choose a puppy, but she never expected to witness a sick pit bull about to be put down. At that moment, she did something astonishing. "Wait, please don't," she pleaded. Her urgent, high-pitched voice broke through the stillness of the shelter's hallway. The sudden outburst startled the staff member, causing her grip on the leash to falter, while the door to the dog's cage stood halfway open. Inside the cage, a frail pit bull lay curled in the corner, his thin body trembling as if he already knew what was coming next. Miss Jenkins, the shelter worker, turned sharply, startled. Visitors weren't supposed to be in this part of the shelter. How had this little girl even found her way here? She had burst through the doors just as Miss Jenkins was about to lead the pit bull to his final destination. "This isn't the right time, sweetheart," her mother said, trying to keep her voice calm. But the girl stood her ground, her determination unwavering. "Please," she implored, her voice thick with emotion. "Don't let this dog die." Miss Jenkins hesitated, glancing at the pit bull. His ribs were painfully visible beneath his patchy, dull fur. His eyes, clouded with sickness, barely held on to life. Max had been here for too long, and his condition had worsened beyond what the shelter could manage. No one had come forward to adopt him. No one had given him a second glance. This was supposed to be the only choice left. At least, that's what they had told themselves. Miss Jenkins swallowed hard. Euthanasia was meant to be an act of mercy, a final kindness. But as she looked at the little girl before her, something in her resolve wavered. The leash remained in her grip. The cage door was still open. Max had yet to move, resigned to whatever fate awaited him. But that little girl, she wasn't ready to give up. Just then, a woman appeared behind the girl, slightly out of breath, as if she had been running. Jane. The girl's mother reached out and placed a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder. But the girl didn't move. "Mom," she murmured, her voice shaking. "Just look at him." Jane followed her daughter's gaze, her eyes landing on the pit bull's frail body. His breathing was shallow, his dim eyes unfocused. She bit her lip, torn between logic and the overwhelming emotion swelling in her chest. "Grace, we should let them do their job," Jane said softly. But there was little conviction in her voice. Grace shook her head. "No, not yet." Miss Jenkins took a deep breath and glanced at the vet tech waiting for her signal. Time seemed to stretch, the weight of the decision pressing down on them. "Please," Grace whispered again, so faintly yet with an urgency neither Miss Jenkins nor her mother could fully grasp. Jane exhaled slowly, realizing there was no simple way out of this moment. She crouched beside her daughter, her voice gentle. "Sweetheart, this dog is very sick," she said. "He's in pain. Sometimes making difficult decisions is the kindest thing we can do for them." But Grace wasn't listening. Her eyes remained locked on Max. And then, without hesitation, she stepped closer to the cage. Miss Jenkins instinctively tightened her grip on the leash, but Grace didn't stop. She reached through the bars, her small hand trembling as she stretched it toward Max. The pit bull blinked sluggishly, his head tilted slightly, sniffing the air. His gaze, previously dull and lifeless, finally focused on the girl's outstretched fingers. Jane held her breath. Miss Jenkins froze, unsure whether to pull Max away. But Max didn't flinch. He didn't growl. He didn't retreat. Instead, he gazed at Grace with sorrowful, weary eyes. Grace lowered herself to her knees, bringing her face closer to the cage. "It's okay," she murmured, her voice calm and soothing. "It's okay." As she gazed at the trembling dog, her mind drifted back to the start of the day. That morning, Grace had woken up with a strange feeling in her chest, a mixture of excitement and unease. She had been waiting for this day for what felt like forever. For months, she had begged her mother for a dog. Ever since she had seen their neighbor's golden retriever joyfully chasing a ball in the yard, she had wanted that same happiness in her life. But Jane had been hesitant. Owning a dog was a big responsibility. She didn't want to bring one home, only to realize weeks later that Grace had lost interest. It was a commitment, and Jane wasn't ready to make it lightly. Still, After weeks of pleading and promises, she had finally agreed to visit the shelter. "We'll look," she had said firmly. "But we're not bringing home a dog just because it looks cute. We have to be sure." Grace had nodded eagerly, understanding that her mother was trying to be responsible. But in her heart, she had already made up her mind. She knew she would find the perfect dog, one that needed her just as much as she needed it. When they arrived at the shelter, Grace practically bounced out of the car, her excitement bubbling over. Inside, the shelter was bustling with activity. Rows of cages lined the walls, filled with dogs of all shapes and sizes. Some barked loudly, tails wagging in excitement as people passed by. Others lay quietly in the corners, their eyes wary and distant. Grace walked along the rows of cages, carefully peering into each one, hoping to find the right dog for her. Some of the puppies were full of energy, jumping up against the bars, eager for attention. Others remained more reserved, keeping their distance. Just as she was about to give up, something caught her attention. At the very end of the room, in the last cage, lay a pit bull, motionless on the cold floor. He didn't bark. He didn't wag his tail. He didn't even lift his head when she approached. Something about the way he just lay there, so still and quiet, tugged at her heart. She crouched in front of the cage, trying to get a closer look. His fur was patchy and dull, his body frail, as if he hadn't eaten properly in days. His eyes were half closed, his breathing shallow. "Mom," Grace whispered, her voice filled with concern. "Look at him. He looks so sad." Jane knelt beside her daughter, her own heart aching as she took in the sight of the pit bull. He was in rough shape, far worse than any of the other dogs they had seen that day. "Sweetie, he's very sick," Jane said gently. "I don't know if we can help him." But Grace simply shook her head, her gaze never leaving the pit bull. "He just needs someone to love him," she said softly. Jane hesitated, torn between wanting to protect her daughter from inevitable heartache and the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, they could change this dog's life. That was when Miss Jenkins approached, her expression somber. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, "but this dog is scheduled to be euthanized today. He's been here a long time and we've tried everything we can, but he hasn't gotten better." The words hit Grace like a punch to the gut. Euthanized. She knew what that meant. They were giving him an injection that would make him close his eyes forever. The word echoed in her mind. Cold. Final. She couldn't let that happen. But what could she do? In the quiet of the back room, Grace's heart pounded as she reached through the bars. Her fingertips brushed against Max's fur. The pit bull blinked. His weary eyes, once distant, began to clear. For the first time, they held a flicker of curiosity as they met hers. Miss Jenkins and Jane stood frozen, their silence heavy with disbelief. Grace spoke softly to the dog, her words barely audible, yet filled with warmth and tenderness. Then Max did something no one expected. He leaned forward just slightly, his nose pressing against her small hand. The room remained still. The tension in the air was thick. Miss Jenkins felt the leash in her hand slacken as she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The vet tech shifted uncomfortably, waiting for instructions. And then, without a word, Grace reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. She unfolded it carefully, her hands shaking as she smoothed it out on the floor. Miss Jenkins, Jane, and the vet tech stared at the paper, unsure of what they were seeing. It was a simple drawing, a child's sketch of a dog with a heart above his head. Next to the drawing, in wobbly handwriting, were the words, "I'll be your friend." And that was the moment everything made sense. The most surprising thing about Grace wasn't just her desperate plea to save Max. It was the realization that she had come prepared, convinced in her heart that this dog, this frail and broken soul, was meant to be hers. Before she had even laid eyes on him, she had written him a promise, a vow of love and care, as if she had always known they were destined to find each other. Jane stared at her daughter, her expression a mix of shock and uncertainty. "Grace, sweetheart, we can't just—" she began, her voice hesitant. Yes, we can, Grace interrupted firmly, her tone unwavering. He needs us, Mom. He needs me. Miss Jenkins, observing quietly, felt something shift in her heart. I need to be honest with you, she said gently. Max is very sick. He's been here a long time and he requires a lot of care. We were planning to put him down because we didn't think he had a chance. Grace's eyes brimmed with tears, but her determination never wavered. That's why we have to help him, she insisted, her voice thick with emotion. We can make him better. Right, Mom? Jane looked from her daughter to the pit bull, and something inside her shifted. She saw the way Max looked at Grace, the silent plea in his tired eyes. She took a deep breath and nodded. Okay, she whispered. A slow smile spread across Grace's face. We'll take him. Miss Jenkins blinked, stunned. You will? She asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. Jane let out a small, breathless laugh. Yes, she said, her tone resolute. And that moment, Max's fate changed forever. And with steady resolve, they took him home, determined to do whatever it took to help him heal. Against all odds, Max left the shelter that day. Not at the end of his journey, but at the start of a brand new chapter. The first few weeks were tough. Max needed constant care, medications, special baths, and frequent vet visits. But Grace never wavered. She stayed by his side, comforting him, stroking his fur when he was in pain, whispering words of encouragement. Slowly but surely, Max began to recover. His fur grew back, his eyes brightened, and his energy returned. The once weak dog who could barely lift his head was now chasing Grace around the yard, his tail wagging wildly. But more than just healing, Max became a protector. He watched over Grace with unwavering loyalty, always at her side, always ready to defend her if needed. And in return, Grace loved him with all her heart. They were inseparable. But not everyone welcomed their new companion. Some neighbors whispered behind Jane's back, questioning her decision to let her daughter keep a pit bull, especially one with such a troubled past. They warned her that pit bulls were dangerous, that it was only a matter of time before something went wrong. Jane tried to ignore them, but doubt crept in. One evening, after an exhausting day, she sat beside Grace, her voice soft but serious. Are you sure about Max? She asked gently. Are you certain he's the right dog for us? Grace met her mother's gaze, her eyes filled with certainty. Mom, Max would never hurt anyone. He's good. He just needed someone to believe in him. Jane nodded, hoping her daughter was right. Then one afternoon, something happened that made Jane question everything. Grace was playing in the yard when a stray cat wandered in. Max, still full of energy, spotted the intruder and bolted after it. The cat hissed and swatted at him. Jane's heart stopped as she saw Max's powerful jaws snap toward the cat. She was sure something awful was about to happen. But then Max hesitated. He pulled back, his body tense but controlled. He looked at the cat, then at Grace, and slowly backed away, his tail wagging uncertainly. Grace knelt beside him, wrapping her arms around his neck. It's all right, Max, she whispered. You're a good boy. In that moment, Jane knew her. Daughter had been right all along. Months passed, and Max became a cherished part of the family. The once sick and broken pit bull was now strong, happy, and full of life, not just because he had healed, but because someone had believed in him, when no one else did. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in warm hues of orange and pink, Jane sat on the porch, watching Grace and Max play. She marveled at how much their lives had changed since that day at the shelter. Max had gone, from the brink of being euthanized to a life filled with love, joy, and endless possibilities, all because a little girl had seen something in him that others had overlooked. As Jane watched them laugh and run together, she realized something profound. Sometimes the choices we least expect lead to the most beautiful and extraordinary outcomes. Did you enjoy this story? Would you have acted like Grace? Would you have believed in Max despite what others said? How do you feel about pit bulls? Let us know in the comments below. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe and give it a thumbs up. If you've had a similar experience, share it with us. Thanks for listening. We'll see you in the next video. Have a wonderful day.